Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, photographing bison from celebration to conservation. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Charlie Reinertson. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Take it away, Charlie.
Thanks for that introduction, Rob, and welcome everyone. Really excited for today's topic, and it's also in celebration of National Bison Day, which is tomorrow. So we're gonna really dig into some technical aspects. It's really a photography geared webinar. With that said, towards the beginning of this, we're going to talk a lot about the ecology of bison and how that plays into trying to take a really great photograph of this creature. So just to give you a quick overview of what to expect, I'll just introduce myself, talk to you a little bit about how I came into wildlife photography, and then we'll go into tips and tricks for photographing bison. At the end, we'll finish with a Q&A, so feel free to submit questions as we go, and we'll get to those at the very end of today's chat. My path to photography actually started in the scientific world. I was researching the smooth and spiny softshell turtles in the Mississippi River in Minnesota. And essentially, we wanted to find out if there were any issues with the population of the smooth softshell turtle. Just from anecdotal evidence and looking at population studies that had been done, the smooth softshell turtle was significantly lower population than the spiny softshell turtle. And it was also the northernmost range of the smooth softshell turtle, so that was part of the reason for the lower population. But with climate change and with habitat loss, the Minnesota DNR wanted to understand essentially should they be concerned and do we need to put in additional protections to make sure there's habitat for these species. And through that project, I brought a camera in the field because I was taking photography classes. I essentially was a biology major with an art problem, and I was always taking as many classes as I could in the art building and fell in love with photography. Yeah, I had this great opportunity to be in the field with all of these amazing creatures, creatures that I grew up chasing and trying to catch and spending time learning about them. And the photography side of things just kind of took off. And while I loved the science, I liked communicating the science even more. And so my career has really been geared towards trying to connect people with the natural world through photography and video and writing. And most recently, that's been with guiding with natural habitat adventures. Over the last 3 years, 4 times a year, I'll do trips in Yellowstone, Grand Teton National Parks, as well as on the monarch butterfly migration in Michoacan, Mexico. And these trips are just these amazing opportunities where so much of my work in science communications is done remotely. And I don't necessarily get to see the reaction of the people reading or consuming what I produce. And so getting to be in the field and watching people's response to experiencing something that they've never seen before is just one of the best parts of the job. I do all this work through my company, Two Line Studio, which is a consulting company, and my favorite clients are those that are working in conservation. My home base is in Adirondack Park, and I'm in Saranac Lake, which is the center of the High Peaks region of Adirondack Park. And I love this graphic because Adirondack Park is kind of the hidden secret of national parks, state parks in the United States, even though it was one of the first conserved areas in the late 1800s. And so you're looking at just the outline, the geographic outline of what it would look like if you stuffed all of these national parks inside Adirondack Park. And so it's this massive geographic area, and it's a mix of public and private land. And it's a really fascinating place to be able to study what it's like to coexist with wildlife and with areas that are designated and managed as wildlands. So I moved to this area to develop a climate solutions exhibit for the Wild Center. And the Wild Center is a natural history museum up here and we were able to interview and feature the work of a lot of people working on different facets of climate solutions in Adirondack Park. And so this just immersed me in this place. It was a really creative project. And at the end of this project, I was solely focused on this full time. I launched my business, Two Line Studio. And one of the big aspects of my work here is focused on the Northern Peatlands Project, which is uh, highlighting one of these habitats, peatlands, which are essentially wetland areas where you have these deposits of organic material that's accumulated over thousands of years. And these places are havens for biodiversity. They are just they have such huge carbon and climate impacts because they store so much carbon. And there are huge restoration efforts that are underway to try and bring these landscapes back because humans over the course of history have destroyed these habitats and converted them to dry land for any number of reasons. So, all of that to say, today we're talking about bison photography. I've got one of my favorite bison photos behind me. And this is my process for all of my video and photo work. Number one is know your subject. Do as much learning about the thing that you're going to photograph as possible. And that learning comes in the form of seeing what other photographers have done in this area. It also comes in the form of the ecology of that animal. Where are they spending their time? What are they doing during different seasons? And what opportunities are available from a composition standpoint? And what's their habitat like? What's the background going to be like so that I can think about the different lighting scenarios that might happen in the field? The next one, know your variables. And this is kind of thinking about more from the technical side of being able to use your camera and when to step in and take control of the settings. There will be times when your auto settings, whether it's aperture priority or full automatic, are going to really do a great job. And there are going to be times where that falls flat and you need to take over. And so you need to know the variables so that if you're in a situation where you're not liking the images you're getting, you know how to adjust. Next, I'm all about being spontaneous in the field, but it's also really great to have a plan because sometimes it's overwhelming. You get to a herd of bison and you don't even know where to start. How do I get a great picture out of this? So having a plan ahead can really help with that, and having that be an iterative process where I go out, I have a session where I'm taking pictures of bison, I go home, I edit, and I see something where I'm like, wow, that was accidental and I loved that. Something happened there that was really cool, and I want to modify these three things so that I can make that better. And that's what's going to get you to the place of having pictures that you're really proud of. Um, and part of that kind of iterative process is this idea of adaptation. So you're never going to have perfect conditions. You're never going to be able to control everything, especially working with wildlife photography. So it's all about being adaptive and moving and adjusting what you're doing. The next one, when you get back home and you've got your library of photos, I like to edit like Ansel Adams. I pretend that I'm in a dark room and I think about the way that he was dodging and burning his image. Because a lot of times when you think about photography, there was like this period of time, especially in the 90s, where photographers were getting really bad raps for Photoshop, right? Like, oh, that image is Photoshopped. Well, the reality is Ansel Adams in the darkroom was photoshopping his image, and he was a master. And the reason why we're so drawn to his images is that he captured a neutral image in the field that perfectly got the composition and the lighting that he wanted. And then he was masterful in getting in the darkroom, dodging and burning areas to make things really high contrast, and figuring out how to blend an image so that it's pleasing to the eye while still being authentic to the moment. And so that's my process is to try and edit like Ansel. And then, in addition to that, find your heroes. Like, who are the people that you look up to in this field? Study their work, follow their work, learn about their process, and then see what you can, take away from that and apply to your own work. So, we're about to go through this process with Bison as an example. Number one, know your subject. So bison have a sordid tale in North America. Between 30 and 60 million bison roamed in North America. And you're seeing in 1500 what that geographic range would have looked like. These bison are spanning coast to coast in North America, all the way up into Canada, down into Mexico, across to the eastern seaboard, across to the western, almost to the western seaboard. And then you're seeing 1870 come around. So this is the period of time when bison were being heavily, heavily hunted. 1880 is a fairly low point for bison. And that was the point at which, there were only 200 to 400, maybe 500 bison in all of the herds in North America. And so at that point in time, that's when we realized, gosh, if we don't do something now, we're not going to have bison on the landscape. And since then, there's been a huge effort of conservation. And this kind of brings me to why I guide for Natural Habitat Adventures and not other companies, because Natural Habitat Adventures partners with World Wildlife Fund to ensure that the travel that they book for their guests and for is feeding the local economy in a way that helps protect and restore habitat and local species. And so World Wildlife Fund is one of the leaders in bison restoration. And they're the reason why we have bison, they're a part of the reason why we have bison today. Here's another graph just taking a look at the population in Yellowstone National Park specifically. So 1901, bison restoration begins, and you look at that population, it's next to nothing. So a lot of these herds were actually brought back to the landscape by being reintroduced from other geographic areas where herds were still intact. Um, and you're seeing a number of different events along the way that affected the population as we go along this curve up until about 2019, where this graph ends, sitting at about between 4,000 and 5,000 head of bison in Yellowstone National Park. So I'm getting these stats from the Atlas of Yellowstone, and I'll just pull this up. The Atlas of Yellowstone is mostly pulling its information from the wild migrations, essentially research that's published by the University of Wyoming, which is my alma mater for my graduate program. And this is the Atlas of Wyoming's ungulates. They're publishing information that I would never have dreamed of being accessible when I was studying this, even in 2013 when I was getting my master's. So they were starting to publish this research then, and it was blowing the minds of the scientific community. A lot of that information is published in this resource, which is the Atlas of Yellowstone. This is going to have so many different types of information of Yellowstone National Park. It's my go-to guide for Yellowstone. As you can see, it's hefty, but I never go to Yellowstone without it. It's the most important resource that I carry, and it has really nice organization. What I like about it is that it's really detailed and granular, but the way that I use it is to learn about new topics that I haven't learned about before, and then I'll find books that dive more deeply into that topic. So that's a great book. And then, just as long as we're talking about books, the other one that I'll recommend is the 150th anniversary of Yellowstone National Park that National Geographic put out, and I lost the dust cover. But this book has it's got writing by David Quammen. It has an in-depth look at bison through the ages, and some really spectacular maps. A lot of work that's featured, in the migration from the migration atlas. So it's the 150th anniversary of Yellowstone. So we'll get some links in here at the end of the talk, but just to show you where my information's coming from. Uh, all right, so we talked a little bit about the history of bison. Conservation efforts are the reason why we have conservation herds that have healthy populations of bison today. With that said, their ranges are greatly reduced, and one of the best places that you can see bison is in Yellowstone National Park. So here it's showing the seasonal distribution of Yellowstone bison. And you're seeing a high concentration of bison in Lamar Valley and Hayden Valley. This is not showing Grand Teton National Park. Grand Teton is to the south of this area, and that also has a really healthy bison population as well. So those are kind of the hot spots of areas to see bison. And just to give you a sense of like the landscape, what it feels like, and the distance that you can be from these animals, there are park regulated distances you have to maintain. So that's one factor you have to consider as you're doing photography. And the other factor is you never want to use flash with the vast majority of wildlife. There are some instances of wildlife where it's okay to use flash, but in, you know, for the most part, you want to avoid it. And one of the biggest considerations when you're photographing this animal is that, as you can see, this animal has dark fur. And so that's a huge consideration when you think about exposure. So we were talking earlier about know your settings, know your camera. And for me, when I'm photographing bison, I'm almost always overexposing the image so that I can maintain detail in the shadows. The other thing that becomes highly important is lighting. Like I said, I'm not using any flash photography. I don't want to upset these animals. And so you're trying to take as many pictures as possible so that at one moment in time, you get stunning lighting, just the way that light comes through a cloud or spotlights a particular moment. Like this image would not be nearly as good if I hadn't caught that little moment when the sunlight was coming through and hitting this bull bison's face and especially his tongue. All right, let's dive into know your variables. So these are my guiding questions thinking about the different variables that I have at my fingertips to adjust. So number one, aperture. Do I want a shallow depth of field and a low f-stop, so like 1.8? Or do I want everything in focus? That's going to change the feel of the image dramatically. It's also changing how much light is coming into the image. So if uh, maybe I want to prioritize my shutter speed because I want to make sure I freeze motion. Maybe I'm photographing bison in the rut, which happens from late July, August into September, October. There's a lot of activity. Bison are moving quickly. Maybe they're wallowing and rolling back and forth in a pit. Um, so if I want to freeze motion, then I'm going to set my shutter speed before looking at aperture at all. Um, Similarly, thinking about exposure, like I said, bison are a very dark animal. If you want to have detail in the shadows of your image, and the shadows are going to be the bison's face is the darkest part of that whole animal. You need to protect or uncover detail in the shadows by sacrificing your highlights of the image. So essentially, typically when I'm photographing landscape photography or even in on wildlife, I'm trying to protect the highlights. So it means I'm never going to overexpose the image. I'm never going to blow out the brightest part of my photo. With bison, it's almost reversed because it's such a dark animal. Unless you're going for a super moody shot like this one, you want to open up into the shadows, which means you want to force your camera to overexpose. You can do that in manual settings, or say you're in aperture priority, which is what I usually shoot. I'm going to use that plus minus button and then adjust the dial to be able to push it over exposed. Or if I'm in manual, I'm just going to look at my meter and make sure the dots are to the right of center. And I'm going to play around with a couple different shots to be able to see where I like it. The other thing that you can do is you can approach this in post, and cameras are getting better and better with noise levels. So essentially, in post, you can just edit your photo and open up the shadows. But I'll tell you, there's a limit to how much shadow you can open up, especially when you have an animal as dark as bison. So lighting becomes incredibly important. And then also the actual exposure of what you do to the neutral raw image. Um, Finally, ISO. If I need to overexpose an image, it's kind of a happy direction to go. Um, but anyway, you might need to change the ISO. You might need to make a sacrifice. You might need to bump that ISO up, which is going to give you a grainier image. But now we have tools at our fingertips that allow us to get rid of that grain in post. So, and cameras are doing a lot better job of being able to go up, 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 and away with ISO without affecting the image quality. Just a side note, these vans just got rolled out this year, and it was life changing for guides. So NatHab invested in these new Mercedes Sprinters that have these roof lids that pop up like a hat, and it's all automated with the little elevator system. And it just gives you this perfect platform to be able to use it almost like a monopod. So you just put your camera directly on the pad and just shift around, and that gives you stability so that you can shoot at slower shutter speeds than you normally would if you were hand holding. So those vehicles were a huge upgrade. We always had roof hatches, but the ability to fully get them up out of your line of sight is phenomenal. And then just the safety features of these vans made us guides super happy. All right, so what's in my kit? The one on the far right here on my screen is a drone, and that's not helpful in the national park. That's illegal. So we're going to ignore that for the moment, but that's a huge tool in my northern peatlands work where I'm trying not to tremble on that habitat. But these are my go-to lenses. I've got a 20 millimeter, a 35 millimeter, 400 millimeter, and then a 70 to 200 that gives me a little bit of zoom flexibility. I love prime lenses. They're better lenses for your money. You can always crop into a different place if you need to, if you need that flexibility. I've always found that with the image quality these days, that cropping in, you know, to a smaller view of the full image is going to give you just as high of image quality as if I had a zoom lens. For instance, say I'm using that 70 to 200 millimeter lens and I want the reach of a 300 millimeter. I'm going to get an image that's just about as sharp if I crop in to effectively a 300 millimeter than if I used another zoom lens that was like a 70 to 400. The image quality is just better in a prime, and the flexibility of having such big files, you know, unless you're blowing your image up bigger than this, you're really operating, you can crop quite a bit without losing detail. So I use a Nikon Z8. The reason for that is because I ended up getting a sponsorship from Nikon. Otherwise, I would have been shooting with the Nikon Z6. And the Z8, you know, that separately off, you know, sidebar from this conversation, it's basically a different art form. It's absolutely insane, the camera technology of where we are today. Another side note is that Nikon just released an auto capture feature that turns your camera into a camera trap. And if you follow Two Line Studio, I'll be putting out essentially a webinar series to be able to learn how to use that successfully in the next couple months. Next thing, adapt. And this is a big one. So to be able to dive into this, I'm actually going to go switch my screen share. Just give me a moment here to pop over to another screen. And I want to be able to show you some pictures while I'm also showing you the settings behind them. All right, so we're going to share this. So I use PhotoShelter for delivering my files to my client. I also use PhotoShelter to be able to have a portfolio of images. It's both my image storing platform because they allow you, if you buy the plan, it's a much cheaper way to store original files than it is to get a subscription to like Adobe Cloud, essentially. So I love Photo Shelter. It's also like a password protected way to deliver your files. You can also sell your work through this platform. Right now, we're looking at the back end of my Photo Shelter account. So this is not the information that I display publicly when you're looking at my gallery. But this gives me the ability to zoom in on what all of the settings were when I took each image. So today's webinar, we're talking about bison, but this applies to a lot of wildlife. Any wildlife that's dark in color is going to benefit from the tips and tricks that I'm sharing today. So you're seeing this shot was at 1/100, which is a pretty slow shutter speed for the 300 millimeter that I was using. And then I was using it, f-stop of, I believe it was at f8, f9 right here. So you can keep an eye on those values over on the right-hand side of the screen as we go. Uh, but I'm just going to see if I can shuffle through these images here. I thought I'd be able to click through, but I'll have to go into each one. So just highlighting a couple things here. Here's a shot of moose pretty up close. Once again, I'm using that 300 millimeter fix. This is back when I was on Canon. So this is in 2013. And you're seeing that I'm actually overexposing this image. I'm using a shutter of 1/60, aperture of 5.6, so almost fully wide open on that lens. And there's no flash. I'm shooting at ISO 400, but you're seeing that this background is pretty burned out. Like there's no detail in the background because it's so bright, because I was overexposing the image so I could have detail in the moose. And even at this, I still wish I had a little bit more detail. So you're just getting a sense there. These little dots in front of the moose are snowflakes. But this applies to moose. This applies to bear. You know, your camera has limitations in how it interprets a scene. And when it interprets this scene, depending on what metering algorithm you've selected, whether it's evaluative metering, looking at the whole image, or spot metering, picking a spot on the image itself, it just might not expose it properly. You also have flexibility in post to be able to open up the shadows. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute here. It applies to wolves. This image was shot, I just had this fleeting moment to be able to get this picture of 926F. And you can see the exposure is 1/200. Once again, I'm on that 300 millimeter. And the f-stop is 5 because I'm trying to get as much light in there as possible. I remember this moment. I like literally had seconds to get my settings in the right place. And if I could go back again, I would bump that ISO even higher. This ended up being 1250, and I had to do a lot of edits to be able to bring back the detail in the image to be able to get those orange eyes and the orange radio collar around the wolf's neck. Another instance where this applies is if your subject is shadowed, if it's in a tree canopy and you're trying to get detail back in the image, you're going to want to overexpose, and you're also going to want to bring those shadows up in your editing. All right, so let's take one more look here at this image of moose. Moose, especially when they've got their summer coats. So this comes back to knowing your subject. Summer coat is really dark. It's even darker than their winter coat, and it has kind of this iridescent sheen to it. And sometimes when you're in post-production and you take the slider for shadows and you open those up, sometimes it gives it a really weird look. And you can create a better look if you properly expose it for that subject in the field, which means overexpose the image. So you're seeing the theme at this point. But let's take a look at the subject of today's talk. Here's an image of bison, and this is where having a camera like the Z8 comes into play, because this image is great. I love it. I caught this moment where that bison tongue is sticking out. f6.3, exposure of 1 over 3200, because this was shot in late afternoon, broad daylight. It was super bright. I didn't overexpose this because with the Z8, I can bring so much detail back in when I'm editing that image. And it looks like maybe I didn't get the cropped in version, but I'll just zoom in on this. Oh, here it is. So this one is cropped in, same exact image, so we get a little closer look at that tongue. I love this shot. Super fun. But you're seeing the exposure 1 over 3200, f of 6.3. So shallow depth of field. It's going to give you focus on the subject, everything else out of focus. Now, I showed a shot earlier that was really aggressive. The two bison were facing each other. This was in the rut. This was when I was guiding a Yellowstone trip this summer. And that image that I showed of the vans, that's when this moment was from. This particular bison was just strutting through this herd. It was clearly the dominant bison in the herd. And you can see there's like some sagebrush debris. He clearly took his head and just aggressively wiped his head into a sagebrush. And that's something that they do to scent. They're putting their scent on the landscape and they're getting some aggression out. And it was just so much fun. It was so serendipitous that in the next moment, he turned his head. The light hit him right at the right moment, right angle and everything. And you can see I've got an exposure of 1 over 2000. I wanted to freeze motion because I could tell he was about to be active. There was going to be movement that I wanted to freeze. I didn't want any blur. F-stop 3.2, ISO 200. This was like 10 a.m., bright sunlight, some clouds to give you a little bit of filtered light so that there were moments of big spotlights coming through. And I love how this image ended up in just this interaction. And this was the final one in the series. He didn't even charge this other young bull. He was just taking a look. And then this little light hitting his tongue and highlighting his tongue was just super fun for me. And you are seeing that like as the light is changing, you're seeing my settings adjust. I'm in aperture priority here, which is how I shoot almost all the time when I'm shooting wildlife, unless I'm in a really specific scenario where the light is really consistent and I can set it exactly where I want it and get it dialed in. All right. I want to make sure I leave time for questions, so I'm not going to look at every single photo here. Another thing that happens with bison, this is a young bison, is that they shed their fur. And they're doing this basically all the way until they regrow their winter coat. So they rub themselves on trees, and often you'll see them in July looking like this. This was taken August, sorry, yeah. This was taken August 2nd. 1 over 200 for exposure, f-stop of 5.6, ISO of 400, and looks like I was using a zoom lens because this is shot at 67 millimeters. So I was using a 24 to 120 2.8 lens. And the other thing to consider when you're photographing bison is that often bison are going to be near the road, so you're going to have the ability to photograph from your vehicle. That'll be the safest way to be close to these animals. You shouldn't be close to these animals. Never approach wildlife. Always be in a position where you can safely remove yourself from the situation. Unfortunately, there's been a huge problem with bison in Yellowstone National Park of people getting too close. Every single year, tourists are gored and sometimes killed. So this is really important. This is a wild animal, as docile as they might seem. They can jump 6 feet high. They're a more than 1 ton animal that can jump 6 feet high from standing still, and they can run at speeds up to 40 miles per hour. So an incredibly agile animal, even though they're huge. And so you really need to be safe when you're photographing these animals. And one of the best ways to be safe is to be in your car. This was actually taken in Grand Teton National Park. Once again, I'm using that. Oh geez, I had an adapter, an extender. So the USM 1.4X, that's an extender that turned my 300 millimeter into a 420 millimeter. I ended up not using that very much because I felt like cropping got me even sharper images. You should always test. Like sometimes um, I've been really happy with the 1.4x that I got with Nikon with the Z8, but definitely do a side by side comparison where you have the same exact lighting and find out if you need it. You might find that cropping is going to be just as sharp, if not sharper. So that's just a little side note. Um, but this one you're seeing, I'm resting it on my vehicle window. And so it allows me to go to 1 over 60. The rule of thumb is that if you take your focal length, which is in this instance 420 millimeters of effective lens, and you should have a shutter speed that's 1 over that number. So 1 over 840 is what this should be. I broke the rules on this image, but it came out okay because I was stabilizing my camera on the door and this very large animal was not moving. Had it moved, it might have introduced a little bit of motion into the image. Once again, overexposing so that the detail is revealed. One of the challenges with bison, and something I haven't mentioned so far, for me in wildlife photography, an image is unusable if the eye is out of focus. Luckily, technology has come a super long way, and a lot of the autofocus is just locked into eyeballs no matter what. But back in 2013, when I took this image, I was shooting entirely manual focus. I was always zooming in, making sure the eye was in focus, figuring out that distance, and then taking images from there. I would never rely on autofocus, but the game has changed with latest technology. This is one of my favorite shots that I took. We call baby bison red dogs, and unfortunately, some tourists have actually picked up a baby bison, put it in their car, and brought it to an animal shelter because they thought it was a dog. And this image, you can see the dog-like resemblance, but I would think that most people would see the hooves and the nose and realize that it's not a dog. But when they are first born, they are red. Now, let me go back actually to this other image. I thought this one was super fun because these two baby bison are playing, and this was in Lamar Valley. Once again, here you're seeing this is back when I was still using a Canon, and 1 over 800 for the exposure, f-stop of 5.6. That's giving it that blurred feel, so you're getting that plane of distance from the camera where the bison are located is in focus, and everything beyond that in the background is out of focus. And that's because I'm selecting a really wide open aperture, which is also letting in a lot of light. It's again shot with a 300 millimeter and ISO of 400. This is fun, a little fun fact. I used to shoot at 400 no matter what because I didn't know what I was doing. And looking back on my images, it's like, gosh, I wish I knew a little bit more. And it's because I came from film where you're always shooting on 400 millimeter. That was how I started photography in college, was in a dark room. And when I came to digital, I never really took classes in digital. So I was just applying all the things that I learned in the darkroom to digital photography. And I've learned a lot in the years since. So going back, I would have changed that ISO to about 100. I'm always shooting as low ISO as the camera will let me for the creative vision that I have for the scene. I just wanted to share this special moment. We were in Lamar Valley this summer and just had this beautiful moment of the bison in Slough Creek. And then to the left of this image was this double rainbow. And this photo doesn't have it. My phone captured it, but I was otherwise engaged, so I couldn't get a picture of the rainbow itself. When you're taking pictures of the herd of bison, this is the moment when you need to be patient. I would say that right now in my library, I don't have very many respectable photos of a herd of bison. And the challenge is that you've got this incredibly dark animal on a pretty bright landscape. So in this image in particular, it's cloudy, and unfortunately, the bison are not spotlit by light coming in. So for me, usually I'm guiding when I'm taking pictures, and so I'm not spending a ton of time setting up the scene or being patient about letting natural light happen in a way that really gives me what I'm looking for. So this is going to come down to patience. This is going to come down to repetition. If I'm ever going to get a worthy image of a herd of bison, it's going to be because the lighting and the position of the bison, my position on the landscape, all line up. The stars align for a great image. And I would say this one's fine. It's not great. And that's because we need more light on those dark bison so that we can have it properly exposed both for the landscape and for the subject. Here's another shot of bison tongue. And I just love that. If we could zoom in an easier way, I'd show you a little tighter image. They've got purple tongues, and they've got this organ on their face that's called the vomeronasal organ. It's responsible for detecting pheromones. So all of these bison are giving off hormones, pheromones, all the time to communicate with one another. And this big organ in their nose is called a vomeronasal organ, and it helps detect those pheromones. And they're communicating with one another all the time. Especially when you get into the rut, you'll see bison push their nose out, and it's very flexible, and they can push it out and reveal that organ to the air to be able to collect as much information as possible. And something that you'll see behaviorally is bull bison drinking straight from the urine of a female bison, and they're just getting as much information as they can about the health of that individual. The other thing they'll do is urinate in what's called a wallowing pit, which is an area where bison have wallowed and rolled back and forth to be able to coat themselves in dust. But during the rut, they urinate in that area and coat themselves in their urine so that they can display their prowess to the rest of the herd. And often that'll be kind of an early way that male bison will detect, hey, is it worth sparring with this individual, or is this guy a bit stronger than me? I can smell it on him that he's actually gonna, I'm gonna get injured if I engage with this individual. One of my favorite seasons of the year to photograph bison is winter, and also late winter. And this gets really fun because you can blow out the background into just white oblivion, kind of like I've done in this image, and expose the bison perfectly. And it works because you interpret the missing information in the highlights as snow or as winter, right? So in this image, I just happened to be on a roadside with my fellow graduate students, and I think this was 2013 in Lamar Valley, and this baby bison was literally born in front of us, and the mom was licking the bison to be able to return the nutrients that were still on that bison to her system because she just had an incredibly energy intense moment. So I shot this, let's see here, exposure 1 over 60, 1 over 160, f-stop of 4, ISO 400 because I never changed it in 2013, and then with a 300 millimeter lens. The only reason why this is crisp is because I was stabilizing my camera. You normally, again, I should be at 1 over 600 for exposure time if I'm shooting with a 300 millimeter lens, and then I should be bumping the ISO up to be able to expose it properly. And another shot from that same sequence right here, where mom is licking the amniotic fluid off of that baby bison that we endearingly refer to as a red dog. And that bison was up and running about so fast. It was absolutely amazing to watch. So again, all these lessons can be applied to all wildlife. If you've got a dark animal, overexpose your image. Make sure you're exposing for the subject, not for the composition, if you want to have detail in your subject. And then the other way is in post editing. So here's the image that's behind me. And this is one of my favorite shots. If you zoom in on this, you can get some detail of snow in front of that bison. And in this one, I did the opposite of what I'm talking about in this whole talk. Sometimes you want to underexpose your subject. And for me, the story here is that bison, when they get to a certain point in their life, especially male bison, when they're old, they separate from the pack, from the herd, sorry, and they spend their final days alone. So I wanted to create a moody image of this lone bison that no longer associates with a herd and is just spending its final days. Here, this shot was taken, gosh, I bet it was in April. I'm sure we could see if we got to the right settings. This is in March, and this is on the northern end of the National Elk Refuge, just south of Kelly, Wyoming. If you're familiar with that area, you might even know exactly where this is on the tail end of Grovant Campground. And to me, just like underexposing the bison, emphasizing the snow that's sitting in front of the bison, and then the composition of having some branches come in, and the idea that those trees are coming back to life in spring. They've got buds like ready to burst on the tips of their branches, and yet this bison is spending his last days. So that's one of my favorite bison shots. But these same techniques apply to this is a trumpeter swan, also taken at the National Elk Refuge, and it's preening. And for this one, I wanted to protect the highlights. So I wanted to maintain detail in the feathers of this bird. And actually, that image is up here on the wall behind me. And in this shot, I wanted perfect exposure on the bird itself, and that resulted in the background getting washed out. Because if I had allowed the camera to expose this at evaluative metering instead of spot metering, it would have way underexposed for the look that I was trying to get. So again, it's know your settings and then adapt when you're in the field and know how to edit when you get home. All right. I think we'll stop there for now. And I just want to share my screen on something else for just a second here, just to show you what I've been talking about when it comes to how to edit your photo. So, just a little behind the scenes. This is that photo of the tongue. Here's cropped in to be able to show that tongue. And if you look over here on the right hand side of the screen, you're getting all these. I bumped the exposure only to 0.17 because I did a good job in the field with getting the exposure right. But the shadows you'll see are brought up to 74. Let me show you what happens when I put those at 0. That is the image that I shot. Looking back at this, I remember this moment. My priority was talking with guests about the incredible moment that we were having with this bison. And at the very end of that talk, I was able to capture a couple pictures. If I'd had time, I would have done some very different things in how I shot this. But because technology is so good right now, you can bring those shadows out and reveal the details. This is also a stylistic thing. Take a look at other people taking pictures of bison and decide what you like. You might prefer having an image like this that's shot super neutral, almost exactly how you saw it. Or you might get excited and say, gosh, you know what? Let me just take you through my workflow of editing a bison shot. I'm going to set my white point up until the point where they start clipping. And that's where they're clipping when you see this caret up here turn a color. Then my black point, I'm going to set that. Now it's clipping. I'm going to bring it back so it's not clipping. Now I'm going to take a look at my photo and say, this grass is super bright. Let me just back that off, try and get some detail back there by dropping down my highlights. And then, that bison, he's still very dark. I would like to see, that's my highlights. I'd like to see more detail there. So you go ahead and bring that slider up. And as you can see, there's just a ton of flexibility. I know there's a little bit of lag right now, so this is a little bit hard for you to follow along with, but now I've brought those shadows up and you're bringing detail back in to this particular bison. And this is where having a camera that operates really well in low light allows you to see that here's the shot. You never, if we were just going back to reset this image, here's how I shot it out of the camera. F6.3, 560 millimeter, ISO of 500, 1 over 2500 for shutter speed. When you zoom in on this, you start to realize, oh, his tongue is out, and that's pretty fun. And then you bring the shadows out and you start to get detail. For me, that's too much. That's way too much. You got to have a light touch with this. Less is more. So you want to get to a point where you're happy with it and it's showing some good detail, but it doesn't look artificial. So that's just like a little taste of how I do my editing in Lightroom and when I'm channeling the lovely Ansel Adams from the darkroom. All right, let me stop sharing here and I'm going to start sharing on my presentation again. All right, so that seems like it's showing up. Edit like Ansel, we just covered that. So let's go to the last section here. And I know I feel bad. I didn't leave time for questions. I'm very sorry. I wanted to pack a lot in so that you could get as much out of this as possible. But the last part is know your heroes. Follow your favorite photographers. If you don't have a lineup of photographers that you're looking at their work all the time, your work is not going to improve. So Jaime Rojo is one of my favorite photographers. Bertie Gregory for the way that he talks about what he does. Joel Sartor for the sheer tack sharp images that he produces and the clinical approach to photography portraits of wildlife. And then my all-time Anna Atkins, the first photographer in the world using cyanotypes to catalog cyanobacteria back in 1800s. So those are my tips. I've got upcoming talks on December 20th and 27th. If you follow Two Line Studio, you'll see that I also have other events going on. If you're ever in Saranac Lake, come on out to the Hootenanny, which is a live music event that I run every week. And also, I've got an art installation up at Origin Coffee in Saranac Lake. That's the Northern Peatlands work, and that'll be up until January 1st. It's a great time to be in the Adirondacks. You can also follow along on the Northern Peatlands project by, I need to update this link. This will still work, but you'll go to twoline.com/Peat, P-E-A-T. And you can also check out a feature article that Nikon just published by searching Reinertsen plus Nikon to be able to find this article they published on my work on the Northern Peatlands project, where I'm trying to raise awareness of this ecosystem that needs our help. And this is that ecosystem. These are some of my favorite photographs that I've been working on. This body of work has taken a ton of time and dedication. And you can buy a 2025 calendar by going to twolinestudio.etsy.com. And that proceeds from sales of that calendar are going to feed right back into the Northern Peatlands Project. Feel free to get in touch. I'd love to answer your questions by email because I didn't leave. I left 4 minutes. So what do we got, Rob? I bet we've got one question we could answer.
All right. Thank you, Charlie. All right. Well, we do have some questions. So there were a lot of questions about do the light rules that you mentioned work in winter, and do you have any tips for photographing in the wintertime?
Yeah, so in the winter, what happens with your camera is going to interpret the landscape as having tons of light, even though what's actually happening is you're getting reflection from the white snow. So oftentimes we need to reverse out what we were talking about, and potentially we need to underexpose the image. But number one thing here that I would, if you get lost in the nuance of get overwhelmed by the settings, which I've been there, the most important thing you can do is go into aperture priority, change the aperture a few different ways, take the same image with 5 different apertures, f5, f8, f12. See how that changes the composition or what you're getting. Next, go over to shutter priority. bump it down to 1 over 60, bump it up to 1 over 120, and then jack it up really high to 1 over 1,000 and see what it's doing to the image. Photography is just a playground for settings. You can just try a million things and see what you like. What you like might be different than what I like. So if I'm shooting a snowy landscape, the favorite tool that I have is that plus minus button on your camera. And that's the exposure. And you can tell your camera, hey, I want aperture priority. So, camera, I'm going to tell you, I want you to shoot at f5.6. But I also want you to overexpose the image from what you're saying is perfect, because I'm saying I want you to overexpose it. You just take that plus minus button, slide up on your camera, and push the exposure over or under. If you're shooting snow, you want to go under, and just play around. I mean, that's really a huge part of what I'm doing in the field is just adapting to the scenario and testing. I'm trying to put on my scientist hat and say I'm going to shoot this 10 ways and see what I like.
Great. Thank you for that advice. And could you remind us again which camera you do shoot with?
I shoot with the Nikon Z8, which is not the Z9 is basically like a more hardy version, but it has all the same bells and whistles. So the Z8 is a little bit more economical. It's still astronomical in price, but it's a mirrorless system. I'm a huge advocate that no matter what company you go with, if you're at a certain tier of their line, top of the line, middle, whatever, um, there isn't a big difference between camera companies. Like I love Nikon because for me, it shoots raw images that are super neutral in their color profile. And that allows me to come into post editing and bring the color back to a way that I feel is really natural. Whereas Canon has kind of this rose tinted, it's like a warm color profile that for me is super challenging in post when I'm trying to get a really true color.
Great, thank you. So, have you ever been in a situation where you were forced to shoot through, say, a windshield? How do you deal with that in post production?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you have to do what you have to do. Sometimes you have a phone, and that's your best camera. But if you're shooting through a windshield, the number one tip I have is to play with the angle at which you shoot through the windshield to get as little glare as possible. And then you're going to have to shoot manual focus because the window itself is going to screw up the camera's perception of focus. And in post editing, I'd say, sometimes there's a dehaze slider. If you're in Lightroom, dehaze is going to be your friend, and that's going to cut out any glare that you have from the image.
Great, thanks for the tips. So, let me ask you one last question. Would Ansel Adams approve of so much use of technology?
Hell yeah. Oh, it would. I mean, I'm speaking on behalf of the dead, so I'm very sorry for that. But his whole thing was being playful, and you capture the raw detail on your film, and then you still have a big job to do in the studio. You've got to go back and you have to use chemicals and you have to use all the tools in the kit to essentially paint until you create the vision that you have. And maybe that vision is replicating what you remember seeing. That's my vision. Like when I'm taking a picture, all I'm doing in post editing is trying to recreate what I experienced. I don't want it to look different than my memory of it. And of course, my memories are colored by my experience. So, I mean, this is all very objective, right? We're freezing time. We're taking a moment that happened in time and trying to recreate it to share it with other people. And so for me, when I'm doing that, I'm trying to be true to what I experienced and share that experience with others. And to me, it's equally valid for someone to say, my goal is to create an image that evokes an emotion. This is not about recreating a moment in time. This is about creating an experience for the viewer. This is about art. And in that instance, that person might do some pretty wild things in Photoshop, but it's equally valid in my mind. And I think Ansel Adams would have some really interesting things to say about it.
Well, we appreciate you sharing your perspective, Charlie. Unfortunately, that will be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for some closing comments.
Well, thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And feel free, I know we didn't leave a lot of time for questions, so feel free to get in touch, charlie@2line.com. Please check out my work. All my work that you see on the website is available for sale. Get in touch if you'd like to purchase something. I want to get my work spreading as much joy as possible. So thanks so much for tuning in, and see you next time.
Charlie, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. If you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at 800-543-8917 or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.